Welcome back to part two of this Genuine Questions episode about all the weird coincidences that are surrounding Bill Gates all the time. So, in part one, we covered Event 201, which is basically just the fact that 4 months before the coronavirus outbreak, Bill Gates, his foundation, hosted a pandemic simulation where they predicted on what would happen if this novel coronavirus was released from a bat to a human. And then 4 months later, that exact thing just happened to go down. And Bill Gates is the funder of the technology that does the mRNA vaccines. And he made a boatload of money off of this pandemic that he happened to predict and practice for just 4 months before it happened. So we've been doing a coincidence counter and just tracking all of these weird coincidences. And I believe that we are up to 7 coincidences, is where we left off. So we're just going to pick back up there, because there are a few current events that still fit into this pattern. We're going to look at those and then the relationship between Bill Gates and these supposed fact checkers who tell us what the authoritative sources are saying is the truth. And a lot of times these fact checks just raise more genuine questions than provide genuine answers. And I want to read some of them and show everybody what I'm talking about when I say that. So the first coincidence that I want to look at is the monkeypox outbreak that is on the rise. Because guess what happened with monkeypox? They did the exact same thing with that they did with Event 201 and coronavirus. They had a practice pandemic in March of 2021 that predicted that there might be a monkeypox outbreak. And what do you know? There is. And the exact week that they said that this monkeypox outbreak would occur, when they were doing their fictitious practice pandemic, just so happened to coincidentally be within days of when the actual monkeypox outbreak occurred in May of 2022. Startling coincidence, and it is covered here in the New York Post. It says international simulation in 2021 predicted current monkeypox outbreak. An eerily accurate simulation exercise at the Munich Security Conference in March 2021 centered on a monkeypox outbreak and had the rare and potentially deadly hypothetical disease starting exactly when the real one did. The Nuclear Threat Initiative, a nonprofit founded by U.S. media mogul Ted Turner, gathered a panel of 19 experts, including government officials from the U.S. and China, representatives from the World Health Organization and the UN, and researchers from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and major pharma companies. The fictional scenario, sponsored by Facebook co-founder Dustin Moskovitz and his Open Philanthropies nonprofit, hinged on the secret release of a lab-enhanced monkeypox virus that eventually killed 271 million people in a worldwide 19-month pandemic. The simulation's imaginary launch date was May 15th, 2022, the same week that marked the real-world start of the first international outbreak of the viral disease, more than a year after the globalist group met. The NTI copped to the strange coincidence on Tuesday. Again, they are going with the Hillary Clinton defense that this is all just a coincidence. And we've had this twice now with the last 2 major pandemics that we've had, COVID and now with monkeypox on the rise that they're warning us about. We just so happen to have these practice simulations right before the outbreak occurred. Amazing. So naturally, the NTI started getting a lot of questions about the coincidence in this outbreak and timing with this practice simulation, and they didn't want anybody to get the wrong idea. So this is the statement that they put on their website where they explain how this coincidence came to be. In March 2021, NTI partnered with the Munich Security Conference to host a tabletop exercise on reducing high-consequence biological threats. The exercise was designed around a fictional scenario portraying a global pandemic involving an unusual strain of monkeypox virus. Following the recent detection of monkeypox cases across multiple countries, NTI's report on the exercise has appeared in a number of social media outlets, noting that the associated fictional scenario featured a monkeypox outbreak with a start date that roughly coincides with the current ongoing outbreak. Some social media activity has included disinformation about our exercise, and we would like to set the record straight. So let's look at how they set the record straight here. What is a tabletop exercise? A tabletop exercise is a scenario-based, facilitated discussion that uses a fictional story to simulate dialogue among practitioners and experts and to highlight key issues that need to be addressed with the aim of gaining valuable insights about effective approaches for solving difficult problems. They are frequently used by a range of professions to prepare for the worst-case scenarios. So you never hear any stories, though, when they have these tabletop exercise about how they implemented something from one of these exercises that ends up doing a lot of good to save the population from these diseases and disasters. They have all these practices for it just months before these outbreaks occur, and they don't really seem to do any good. And you would think that if something good did come from it, that would be the focus here, that would be the headline. There's not. That's not what they're talking about, so I can only assume that there wasn't really anything effective that is going to help curb the outbreak. Why did NTI choose monkeypox as the pathogen for the fictional exercise? The fact that several countries are currently experiencing an outbreak of monkeypox is purely a coincidence. The key takeaway from our exercise is not the specific pathogen in our fictional scenario, it's the fact that the world is woefully unprepared to guard against a future pandemic, and that we need to take urgent action to address this vulnerability. The NTI doesn't explain anything or set the record straight. They just come out and say, this is a coincidence, and we're all just supposed to be like, okay, that makes sense. And I don't need the NTI to tell me the key takeaway from anything. I understand that they want the takeaway to be that we are perpetually underprepared for all pandemics, so we need to keep paying them to play germ games that do nothing to get us to the level of prepared, or even perhaps over-prepared for a future pandemic. We are going to perpetually be underprepared and just have to keep throwing money at them to solve the problem, even though they never do. I get that that's what they want the takeaway to be, but I've got pockets. I can have multiple takeaways, and it has not gone unnoticed that within a 17-month time span, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation has hosted 2 practice pandemics that coincidentally predicted the virus that would soon surface around the globe. That's a good takeaway, too. So that's what the NTI says in their statement to defend themselves. But it's always a good idea to double check with what the fact checkers have to say, because they are the authority on the subject. So let's see what Newsweek has to say about the claim that Bill Gates predicted the monkeypox outbreak. While Gates has talked about the possibility of bioterror smallpox attacks in the past, his comments have been drawn slightly out of context and don't mention monkeypox. In November 2021, during a policy exchange interview with the chair of the UK's Health Select Committee, Gates warned governments should prepare for future pandemics and smallpox terror attacks. Some of the reports that followed the interview suggested that Gates warned that terrorists would try to use smallpox as a weapon. That coverage was slightly misleading. Gates was in fact talking about simulating the possibilities of such an attack with outright saying that it would happen. So Newsweek is going to have 2 points that they use to debunk this claim. I, of course, have something to say about both of them, but this here is the first one, that Bill Gates has never mentioned monkeypox. He has only mentioned smallpox, and those are not the same thing. But the first quick thing that I noticed is that they don't make any mention of that Munich Security Conference and the monkeypox simulation that the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation funded. So they don't address that point as part of this claim that he predicted the monkeypox yet again. That's not mentioned. It's just he talked about smallpox, and that is different. So not really giving you the full picture of all of the facts here. In April 2017, he said in an interview that advances in biology have made it far easier for a terrorist to recreate smallpox. The same year, he told a Munich security conference that the next epidemic could originate from a synthetic version of the smallpox virus, or a super contagious or deadly strain of the flu. Nevertheless, the post shared on social media in 2022 implied that Gates' insights were far more recent, almost in tandem with reports of monkeypox. But if you do the math from the first one here, says that Gates talked about this at a policy exchange interview with the UK's Health Select Committee in November 2021. So they're acting like the last time and the only time that Bill Gates has ever discussed this possibility was in April 2017, which is not at all 5 years before 2022. So, like, quit pretending like he said something recent. Well, November of 2021, when he made the conference to the UK Health Select Committee, that is in tandem with the monkeypox outbreak. That was 5-6 months before the outbreak occurred in May of 2022. So they are doing a very clever misdirection here to get you to forget about the fact that he also made these comments 6 months before, and they just wanted to seem like he said it 5 years before. They're not. The fact checkers here aren't really painting an honest picture of how frequently Bill Gates talks about this topic. Gates previously estimated that a coordinated smallpox attack could cause tens of millions of deaths, whereas so far only a very small number of cases of monkeypox has been recorded globally. As it stands, while the U.S. has bought millions of monkeypox vaccines, public health officials say the risk is little cause for concern. The CDC said the risk of catching the disease remains extremely rare. So that's the other point that they use to debunk this claim that monkeypox and smallpox are not the same thing. But the monkeypox vaccine works for smallpox, and vice versa. So they are so similar that it's irrelevant when you are talking about the vaccine for it. And if it is such a small number of cases that have been reported globally, it's so rare to catch this, why on earth would we buy millions of doses for a vaccine that they are simultaneously telling us is not that big of a deal and there's a very few number of cases? All right, have a wardrobe change here because I got interrupted when I was done talking about monkeypox, and it's been a couple days before I could get back to it to have the time to finish, but now I want to move on and talk about the next coincidence current event that's in the news right now with Bill Gates, which is him buying up a ton of farmland across the country. Well, Bill Gates is now the largest private farmland owner in the country. And we're going to go through a couple articles and fact checks to see if we can determine why that might be, or if that's just another coincidence that surrounds Bill Gates. So we're going to start by looking at my favorite fact checker, which is Snopes. And Snopes is all over the place with this fact check, so bear with me. I will try to keep it in some semblance of coherency as we go through this. But the claim that Snopes is debunking is former Microsoft CEO Bill Gates owns a majority of America's farmland. They don't rate this as missing context, partially true, misleading. They just flat out say that's false. And the context that Snopes so kindly provides to us to explain why they are fact-checking this particular fact is in April 2022, conspiracy theorists insinuated that billionaire Bill Gates is buying up the majority of American farmland as part of a diabolical plot to cause widespread food shortages. And so you'll notice the difference here. The claim that they are fact-checking, that they are labeling false, has nothing to do with food shortages or even puts any sort of motivation or intention behind Bill Gates. It's just, does he own the majority of America's farmland? Snopes says that's false. But as we are going to read through in this fact check, Snopes is going to spend more time debunking all of that context that Snopes added into it instead of just addressing the claim. And if you want to be fair about the claim that they are fact-checking and you want to be a real fact-checker, you would put in the context that while Bill Gates doesn't own the majority of U.S. farmland in the sense that he doesn't own 50.1% of the U.S. farmland, he is the largest private farmland owner in the United States. So nobody else owns a larger percentage of it than Bill Gates does. Fact check that Snopes provides here is in April 2022, researchers warned about the potential risk of a global food shortage spurred on in part by Russia's ongoing attacks on Ukraine. Because the war in Ukraine is the fault of everything, apparently. So while there are no nationwide food shortages in the United States, nor widespread disruptions in the supply chain, the potential of such shortages caused many people to feel that their food security was suddenly uncertain. So I don't know what parts of the country Snopes is based out of, but I do know there is a definite shortage of food and, as we're going to talk about here in a little bit, baby formula that is going on in the United States. And every time that there is a disruption in this supply, it's always blamed on the supply chain. So I don't know what's Snopes is fact checking here, but it's not jiving with what I see with my own two eyes. In the wake of this uncertainty, unfounded rumors began to spread that attempted to lay the blame for any coming food shortages on nefarious sources. One such rumor claimed that there had been an unusual number of fires at food processing facilities in 2022. The explanation offered by conspiracy theorists for this untrue claim was that these fires were being intentionally set in order to create a food crisis. In reality, the number of fires was not extraordinary, the causes of the fires were not unusual, and the damage caused by the fires was minimal. So, we're going to come back to those claims here in a second. Finish up here with Snopes, though. It says, why does Gates own so much farmland? While viral conspiracy theories baselessly conjecture that Gates is buying up farmland in order to starve Americans for some unknown reason, there's likely a simpler explanation. Gates makes money off the land. Snopes isn't checking the facts, they're just telling you what they think is the more likely motivation. And that's not fact-checking, and as I already pointed out, they have gotten wildly far away from the claim that Bill Gates owns the majority of U.S. farmland. Now they are fact-checking people's opinions about what his motivations might be. It says, during the COVID-19 pandemic, vaccine-hesitant Americans were inundated with false rumors claiming that Gates was putting microchips into vaccines, that he was working on a mind-altering vaccine, and that Gates has put tracking devices into vaccines, and that he once called for vaccinations as a way to depopulate the planet. These rumors, like the present rumor about Gates buying up the majority of farmland in the United States for nefarious purposes, are all false. So, since they are sort of lacking on their substance here in this particular claim about the farmland, they just throw in every other conspiracy theory about Bill Gates, even these ridiculous ones that we've talked about in previous episodes that I don't think people really actually believe. I'm sure a handful of people out there could believe anything, but think they purposely put these crazier conspiracy theories into the conversation pool so that way they can do exactly what Snopes is doing right here and just discredit all of them in one swoop. But it seems that the main takeaway that Snopes wants you to have is any bad thing that you've ever heard about Bill Gates is false, just because we say so. We are going to talk about this comment here that vaccinations is the way to depopulate the planet here at the end of this video, but before we move on to that topic, do want to go back to this arson here that Snopes just brought up. So we have PolitiFact now fact-checking these arson claims, and I chose this fact-check because I want to point out that they are not fact-checking the authoritative sources to make sure that the public is informed and that the information that we're getting from the people in charge is true and accurate. The official fact-checkers here are fact-checking anonymous Facebook posts that people make. They don't even put the name of the person who initially made this claim because they're nobody. They're not going to fact check the things that Bill Gates tells you or anybody in government, what they tell you, or anybody at the World Health Organization or the CDC. They don't fact check those people. They are out here to fact check the opinions and rumors that go around on social media by regular people. Like our influence is somehow greater than that of the world's billionaires and people in positions of power. But PolitiFact says that Facebook post said on June 7th that a 95-item list of food-destroying incidents demonstrates that you're duped if you think that they aren't planning a food shortage. And they say this is false. It's a frighteningly specific list of 95 agricultural incidents involving fires and destroyed poultry, and it's all over social media. PolitiFact wondered if there was anything to this lengthy claim, so we reviewed each of the incidents cited and found no merit to the suggestion that anything nefarious is afoot. So, PolitiFact themselves was able to conduct an entire investigation into the intentions and the motives and maybe potential criminality of all 95 of these cases. So, or they're just telling us their opinion that nothing nefarious is afoot. One of the two. So their ruling is that most of the incidents listed involve chickens or turkeys being killed because they were exposed to a highly contagious avian influenza, and many referenced fires that officials said weren't suspicious. The post relayed incorrect information about some of the incidents, and we found no evidence that 2 out of 95 incidents happened at all. Experts in research avian influenza said legitimate incidents do not demonstrate there's an ongoing effort to create food shortages. Crazy, as in part 1 of this video where we talked about Event 201, the role of the free press, the reason that we have the First Amendment is not to protect Jim Acosta when Donald Trump calls him an asshole. The purpose of the free press is to be a watchdog on the government, not a mouthpiece for the government. And the fact that this has somehow gotten flipped and is clearly being used as propaganda drives me crazy that more people just cannot see that for what it is. Now I want to read this screenshot from The Guardian because it brings up just a couple interesting points that I want to touch on real fast. So they do acknowledge that Bill Gates is the biggest private owner of farmland in the United States. Said in total he owns approximately 242,000 acres of farmland, which is nearly the size of Hong Kong. So, Snopes can split hairs, call that false, but clearly the general sentiment of what people are saying when they make this claim is true here. Cascade Investment, which is the firm making these acquisitions, is controlled by Gates, and the firm said it's very supportive of sustainable farming. It is also a shareholder in the plant-based protein companies Beyond Meat and Impossible Foods, as well as the farming equipment manufacturer John Deere. Bill Gates is the funder of these fake meat alternative companies, the Beyond Meat and Impossible Foods, where they have these soy plant-based alternatives to everything. So Bill Gates is a big-time investor in that, so he would benefit from maybe not necessarily a food shortage, but certainly would benefit from people needing to rely on his meat alternatives as opposed to actual legitimate beef. We're going to come back to that in a minute here, but the writer of this article points out the principal danger of private farmland owners like Bill Gates is not their professed support of sustainable agriculture, often found in philanthropic work. It's the monopolistic role they play in determining our food systems and land use patterns. So, the point here to me is that if somebody does own all this land, especially somebody who we say billionaires are greedy, you don't become a billionaire if you're not corrupt. So Bill Gates would be arguably one of the most corrupt people in the country. And how are we supposed to just assume that he has our best interest at play and that he wouldn't want to create this monopolistic role for profit? Whether it is through creating a food shortage or getting rid of beef so people have to use his plant-based alternative. There are several possibilities, none of them great. And if you think that I sound like a crazy conspiracy theorist for suggesting that Bill Gates might be motivated to do that, let's see what Bill Gates says in an interview that's reported on here in The Hill. I do think all rich countries should move to 100% synthetic beef, Gates said when asked about how countries can help to reduce methane emissions when it comes to food production. So when you hear people talking about the Green New Deal and trying to outlaw cow farts, that's where they got this from, is Bill Gates says that's how his 100% synthetic beef is going to help the environment, is the cows won't be farting into the atmosphere and destroying the ozone layer. He goes on to say, you can get used to the taste difference, and the claim is they're going to make it taste even better over time. The philanthropist and Microsoft co-founder told the outlet he is hopeful that a turn to plant-based proteins will help combat methane emissions produced by livestock. Eventually, that green premium is modest enough that you can sort of change the behavior of people or use regulation to totally shift the demand, Gates said. What he's talking about is something that I've talked about on this channel several different times, which is that frog in boiling water analogy, where you can't just throw a frog into a scalding hot pot of water because it's going to jump right out. But if you put it into room temperature water and incrementally turn up the heat, then the frog is not going to notice those subtle changes, and it will ultimately boil to death. So Bill Gates is talking about that with humans, that you can use regulation and shift the demand and shift human behavior through not people's free will, but regulation. People don't even put up a fight because they're losing their free will just a teeny little chip at a time. The last thing that I want to show you about with the farmland topic, here's this article from NBC News, because it shows the great lengths that Bill Gates went to keep these cascade investments and their acquisitions of all this farmland under wraps. So Cascade Investments has bought its farmland through a web of at least 22 limited liability shell companies across the country. These shell companies have made it difficult to find out where and how much farmland the Gateses own, even for local farmers. But some farmers who listen to that of the Gateses have expressed disappointment that despite the couple's wealth, they have not done more to protect the environment. So you would think that the climate change, this Bill Gates' number one goal, that he was trying to implement that sustainable farming and help the environment instead of just solely relying on eliminating all the cows and their farts. That maybe there are some ways to help reduce these carbon emissions through sustainable farming. He doesn't do any of them. So I want to pivot from the adult food shortages that we were just talking about and get into this baby formula shortage that just happened here. And we're going to start by adding another coincidence to the counter here, that Bill Gates just so happened to invest in a startup firm that creates synthetic breast milk. So we have a baby formula shortage. Bill Gates is on the horizon to save the day because he just so happened to be spending all this time and money investing in a synthetic option that he can sell to everybody. And here is what the officials at factcheck.org have to say about this. Gates' investment in startup firm is not related to the baby formula shortage. A fund backed by Bill Gates has invested in a startup working to develop lab-manufactured breast milk, but it won't reach the market for several years. Yet social media posts make baseless claims that Gates is behind the current baby formula shortage. So again, we're not fact-checking anybody in authority. We're making sure we're correcting the record of anonymous social media users. Breakthrough Energy Ventures, a fund backed by Bill Gates that invests in climate-friendly technologies, in 2020 led a $3.5 million round of financing for BioMilk, startup working on reproducing human breast milk using mammary cells. The company's product hasn't made it to market. A June 2021 blog post noted that we're only in our first trimester. A frequent target of conspiracy theories, Gates is again being falsely blamed for a national crisis. Again, all of these connections between Bill Gates and these national crises that he just keeps getting falsely blamed for, they're all just coincidence, apparently. But these repeated claims of this product is 18 months to 2 years away, it's years away from FDA approval. Just like to remind everybody that so was the COVID vaccine before that rolled out. It was not FDA approved. It was still in the clinical trial stage, but there was an emergency need for it, so it got the emergency use authorization from the FDA. If you go back and watch the Big Pharma episode that we have on this channel, then you will see the incestuous relationship between the regulators and the FDA and the pharmaceutical companies, and how it's all just basically a corrupt scheme of kickbacks. So if your product is either maybe close to going to market and you want to get that extra funding to get yourself over the finish line, a great way to do that would be to create the emergency need for whatever product it is that you have in development. And if there is this emergency need for it, recent history has shown us that they will cut through the red tape to fast track your product out to market, even if it's not 100% ready to go yet. So that is what Bill Gates did with his vaccine investments. I don't understand why it is so far-fetched for the fact checkers out there to at least consider the possibility that he's taken that same strategy and used it with his synthetic breast milk investments as well. We're done with the coincidence counter for now, but there's just a couple more things that I want to talk about to close up this video. And when I was putting all this information together, I was actually looking into the rumor that Bill Gates would create viruses for Windows, so in that way he could sell people the antiviral software. And while I was trying to find something to back up that rumor that I heard, I actually stumbled across this article, and I want to read this to you instead because it was written in 1998, and it's a warning from a computer scientist about the dangers of Bill Gates and Microsoft and this monopoly that they were building. And especially with the benefit of hindsight, it is really insightful, the warnings that he was giving and the dangers that he was pointing out. And unfortunately, it doesn't seem like his message was really heard because we're in the situation that he describes right now. So this is an interview between the computer scientist who wrote this book about Microsoft and Bill Gates and a person that was interviewing him. So I just picked out the questions and answers that I thought were relevant to the situation that we all find ourselves in today. Microsoft has a quasi-monopoly in some information technology sectors, such as operating systems and application software. But its sales only represent 2% of total hardware and software sales in the world. If this is the case, why should we be worried about its domination? This figure of 2% is not the correct number to examine. It gives a false impression that Microsoft, as a software publishing company, is just a minor player in the computer business. If you look at the profits of the 10 leading software companies, Microsoft alone accounts for 41% of these profits. In any case, these figures are not the best indicator to understand the phenomenon that I am denouncing. To control an industry with a scope as wide as the computer industry, a company does not necessarily need to control 90% of its sales. Take an example from revolutions. To overthrow a government, do rebel forces try to secure control of the entire territory of a country? No. They only need to conquer the 0.1% of the country's activities that are considered strategic. Radio stations, television stations, the telephone network, and a few key institutions, such as the army or the central bank. For economic activities, it's the same thing. Some strategic elements are more important than others. I have a lot of people tell me that these conspiracy theories are not possible because there would just have to be too many people involved to pull it off and too many people would have to keep their mouth shut. And that answer that he gave right there is part of the reason why I disagree with that, because not every single person has to be knowledgeable and aware of the greater plot that's going on. It only takes the few key strategic people who are in the right places and the right positions of power, and then they can just instruct their subordinates who now are just following orders, don't necessarily know what the greater plot is. So There are ways to manipulate people into doing what necessarily putting them in on the plan. So this question answer is pretty insightful because remember, in 1998, and given how much computer technology Microsoft have now come to live to, it's pretty impressive the foresight that this Roberto computer scientist had. It is difficult to find a more important product in today's economy, information or services more strategic, dealing with its creation, transmission, and manipulation. If one company alone, such as Microsoft, manages to obtain a quasi-monopoly over the worldwide information and communication chain, as they are attempting to do, this could be a danger for democracy. Computers are already beginning to shape the way we learn, the way we work, the way we entertain ourselves, the way we heal ourselves, the way we consume, and also the way we formulate our opinions. And that is a huge danger to democracy, because a lot of people do use the information that's available to them on the World Wide Web to formulate their opinions. And imagine how easy it would be for the authoritarians or for the thought police if they controlled access to that information and got to determine what people were allowed to even know about in the first place. Is it really relevant to make a comparison with Orwell's idea of Big Brother? The current threat is far worse. In 1984, Big Brother used cameras to watch over people, but these people were still free to hide their thoughts. Above all, they knew that they were being watched and were always on their guard, ready to fight to get their freedom back. But in today's world of computers, people have total trust in the information technologies they use to exchange email, talk on mobile telephones, make travel plans, write memos, manage their money and their investments, buy things. This covers almost all the private and social activities that people are involved in. Companies trust all their strategic secrets to computer networks. It is technically possible to find traces of all this information without your knowledge and without using cameras that are easily seen. You can see that this information concerns your privacy much more than merely watching over you with a camera, especially if all this information falls into the hands of one company. Do you mean that Microsoft has a diabolical plan to control our lives? What motivates Microsoft is its dread of losing its dominant position. But if you consider its motto, which is embrace and extend, and the objective that it announces, which involves taking control of entire information and communication chain, in the short term, this means controlling the internet, Microsoft is currently creating a technological instrument that may effectively be used to control our lives. Once this instrument exists, there will be someone, even if it is not Microsoft, who will use it for that purpose. If you've seen the movie The Dark Knight Rises, similar concept to why Christian Bale wants to flood the reactor chamber down there, because he says that once Dr. Palvo learned how to turn the core into a bomb, even if he is dead and he was the only one that knew how to do that, somebody else will be able to take that technology and use it for evil. So Batman's just trying to destroy it. Same concept that Roberto is saying here, that if you create the technology and you build this information system to harvest everybody's information, eventually someone will come along, even if it's not the creator of it. Someone will figure out how to manipulate it and use it for evil. But if Microsoft does effectively manage to dominate operating systems for personal computers, communication networks, web browsers, and the brains for servers used to make up the internet, the corporation would be in a position with much more control than a company, in the past, that would have owned all the world's printing presses. It would actually have the power to make insidious decisions as to who would have access to information and which information you could access. We have already seen when talking about IBM that the founders of Microsoft were very pragmatic businessmen rather than technological visionaries. They had a remarkable flair for spotting opportunities and filling a need before others, although they did this with mediocre products. But over the years, Microsoft has acquired a remarkable ability to convert its technical failures into commercial successes. While its new programs are often disastrous, the big guns in its marketing department manage to sell them anyway. Microsoft has managed to make people think that the problems with its programs are normal and that corrections to these problems are technological breakthroughs. Even better, it is the consumer who pays for improving its products. So that's pretty similar to what they do now with the cell phone updates, the video game updates, even with the vaccines. They have this first generation that comes out to the market, and then with the profits that they make off the first wave, that is how they improve it and upgrade it and make it better, so then they can get all the bugs worked out and then either improve it so the next round of people are interested in it, or now have created the situation where the first round is really no longer effective or is obsolete, and those people now have to pay for the upgrades. If, as you have pointed out, the community of computer experts thinks that Microsoft products are so bad, why haven't these people spoken out before? There are many computer specialists who have the knowledge necessary to see through the smoke and mirrors and point out the errors, dangers, and manipulations without running the risk of being criticized as jealous competitors. But these people have been quiet for too long. It is true that this vacuum has been filled by pseudo-experts who mostly churn out disinformation. I think there are a number of reasons for this, and not all of them are glorious. There is one reason why serious experts do not write articles in this type of magazine, because they are afraid that their reputation may be marred by this association with snake oil salesmen. Unfortunately, this has contributed to a vicious cycle. Since the experts ignore them, and since they depend mostly on their advertising, computer magazines are often no more than a mirror for the propaganda fed to them by hardware and software manufacturers. Also, the pseudo-experts who have established themselves there do not necessarily want this to change. And again, a lot of similarities between that and the scientists and doctors who have a different opinion about some other hot button topics going on right now, like the transgender issues or the response to COVID. Those people that have the opinions that go against the mainstream news propaganda, they just get silenced, ostracized, have their reputations smeared. Which not only has the effect of discrediting the person who is brave enough to speak out, but then sends a message to a lot of people who might have thought about speaking out of this will happen to you if you don't fall in line. Bill Gates presents himself as the voice of competition, but you explain that Microsoft actually uses every means at its disposal to eliminate its competitors. Can you describe the method you accuse this company of using more precisely? Microsoft's public statements totally contradict the company's practices. On the one hand, Microsoft says our software is best because the public buys it. On the other hand, it uses a very sophisticated arsenal of techniques to prevent the public from choosing anything other than its products. This shows that the leaders of this company do not believe at all in the quality of its programs. When you look at Microsoft conquests and practices individually, this all looks very banal. It is a bit like a game of chess, where if you only watched a few moves out of context, you would see a pawn being taken, a knight put in check, a rook advancing, nothing spectacular. But when you step back and look at all of Microsoft's strategies and all the battles it has fought and won, you see a chronicle of monopolistic conquest. I think that is a really good way to articulate what I kind of see this channel as, where if maybe you just watched one of these videos randomly out of context, might be like, whatever, a lot of coincidences, she just doesn't like Bill Gates, she doesn't like Hillary Clinton, whatever. But when you watch the entire series of videos, it does paint a much larger 3D chess moves that I think it's reasonable to suspect that these people are making. Just based on their own public statements and their actions, it's at least on the table that these are the chess moves that are being made. But why, as a consumer, should I refuse a free program that simplifies my life as well? This is actually something that my mom and I talk about a lot more in the present day in relation to Amazon, but the concept is still the same. That to not always just order things off Amazon because it's convenient and easy, because you are putting a lot of those small businesses out of business and contributing to this power grab that Jeff Bezos has and this monopoly that he is building. And then if they decide they don't want you as a customer anymore, you've taken away all your other competition and options. Which is what Roberto says here. He says, by doing so, you are helping Microsoft build a monopoly over information transmission, and this is against your best interests. This is a sort of Trojan horse, which in the long term may completely eliminate your possibility of making a choice. Unfortunately, it seems clear from current political discourse that politicians will not be the ones to change this. This collective awareness will only come from public opinion, from millions of computer users who have been marginalized, manipulated, and held in contempt up until now by Microsoft. Perhaps one day they will be fed up with being treated like cash cows and guinea pigs who are considered just good enough to keep quiet and pay for software that doesn't work correctly. And you can take that idea and apply that to whichever current day concept, pandemic you think that it relates to. You go as saying that our passiveness in dealing with Microsoft is a hidden task idle choice. Without a doubt, ability to change the way we live our days. But with this opportunity, there's no such thing as free lunch. If we continue letting Microsoft build it, it may end up looking like a nightmare. It is therefore up to us to choose whether this revolution should lead to a technological dark age dominated by a handful of feudal lords who take control of the means of creating and transmitting information to collect taxes each time we communicate with each other, or if we would rather live in an open and modern world built around democracy and decentralization, where the free flow of information allows us to benefit from the huge potential of borderless cooperation and shared knowledge. I know what I would prefer and what type of society that I would like to live in. I don't need the authoritative sources fact-checking my opinions and telling me what to think. I like having access to all the information I possibly can and forming my own opinion about it. And I hope we haven't gone so far down this road that we have lost that entirely. So to finish up here, I just want to go back to what we talked about in that Bill Gates video, which is, and what Snopes denies happening, which is Bill Gates talking about using vaccines to depopulate the planet. Pretty much all of these instances that we cover in this video, you could look at as a profit motive. That you create the shortage, you create the pandemic, and then you sell people the solution. Maybe Bill Gates is just a very greedy billionaire that doesn't know when to quit. But you could also look at it with a more nefarious motivation, which goes back to the TED Talk that Bill Gates gave, where he says he is talking about climate change and how to reduce carbon emissions. And I'm going to show you the video of him saying it in context here, but he throws up the formula, and it's now talking about how you need to reduce the part of the formula that represents the population. And let's listen to how he says we can achieve that.
This equation has four factors, a little bit of multiplication. So you've got a thing on the left, CO2, that you want to get to zero. And that's going to be based on the number of people, the services each person's using on average, the energy on average for each service, and the CO2 being put out per unit of energy. So let's look at each one of these and see how we can get this down to zero. Probably one of these numbers is going to have to get pretty near to zero. That's back from high school algebra. But let's take a look. First, we've got population. The world today has 6.8 billion people. That's headed up to about 9 billion. Now, if we do a really great job on new vaccines, healthcare, reproductive health services, we could lower that by perhaps 10 or 15%.
Please, somebody explain this in a way that makes sense to me. But vaccines are meant to stop you from dying from preventable diseases, and they're meant to keep you alive longer. So if we're preventing people dying from communicable diseases, how does that reduce the population? Does not make sense to me, so we're going to hand it over to the expert fact checkers over at Snopes to explain this concept to us. Did Bill Gates admit vaccinations are designed so governments can depopulate the world? Snopes says false. In 1997, when he and Melinda first ventured into public health, they focused on birth control. The logic was crisp and Bill Gates friendly. Health equals resources divided by people. And since resources, as Gates noted, are relatively fixed, the answer lay in population control. Gates later came to the conclusion that birth control was not the best approach to achieve the goal of slower population growth, realizing that, counterintuitively, a reduction in childhood mortality was the best way to limit population growth. So Bill Gates is not denying here that his goal is population control. He's saying that that is the best way to manage the limited resources that you have for public health, is you need to control the population. So you can argue that Bill Gates has altruistic motives for his depopulation agenda, or you can argue that he has nefarious motives for it. But it's cannot deny that population control is what Bill Gates is trying to do, because that's what he says. This is the point Gates has made repeatedly, and his views were clearly articulated in a 2009 Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation annual letter. So this isn't a science magazine, this isn't a peer-reviewed journal, this is just his foundation's newsletter that Snopes has gone to fact-check these claims. And that newsletter says, a surprising but critical fact that reducing the number of deaths actually reduces population growth. In fact, parents choose to have enough kids to give them a high chance that several will survive when they grow old. If the number of who survive to adulthood goes up, can achieve this without having many children. So what Bill and Melinda Gates are saying here is that the reason that people have a bunch of kids is because they want there to be a next generation to take care of them when they get old. So they'll have a bunch of kids, and a lot of them are going to die because they're not vaccinated. So you got to hedge your bets and have a bunch of them, so maybe like a couple will be alive to take care of you when you're old. That's what they're saying people's motivations are. So they're saying if they can limit the number of people that are dying in childhood through vaccines, that are use vaccines to limit the number of people that are dying through childhood, then people will just not have as many kids in the first place. So while it's pretty far-fetched to think that Bill and Melinda Gates know the motivations for everybody in the world's family planning decisions, it also just doesn't make sense what they're saying, because if I have 10 kids and 8 of them die in childhood because they're unvaccinated, then they haven't really used that many resources on the planet with their dying in infancy or childhood. The population growth, it's exponential, so it's when people grow up to then have children of their own, and then they branch off and they have 2 kids and they have 2 kids, and then it just keeps growing and doubling in size or whatever. So if you're just having children and then they die, especially if they die before they use up a lot of the resources, which is the entire motivation for this theory, making sure we have enough resources for everybody and for public health, if they're dying before they use up a lot of those resources, then you've contributed to just like a temporary spike in the population, but you haven't contributed to the long-term population growth that they are talking about controlling here. So what they're saying does not make any sense. But Snopes is here to interpret and says, in other words, Gates is not interested in using vaccines to reduce the population by using them as an agent of death or a tool to stare. Rather, Gates is interested in keeping more children alive to reduce the need for parents to have more children, thus limiting the overall population growth. As evidenced in a 2014 paper published in Science that attempted to calculate future population growth, not everyone is convinced childhood mortality is a smoking gun to quell population growth. But Gates's view on childhood mortality contribution to population growth is increasingly discussed in scientific literature and is still subject to debate. What is not up to debate are the intentions of the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation with regard to vaccines and population growth, as articulated by Bill and Melinda Gates. So, great fact checking. You just called up the people that are accused, asked them if they did it, they said no, and you've debunked the entire claim. Even though the actual scientific journals do cast some serious doubt, and common sense also puts a cloud over these claims that they're making. That somehow if you reduce the that are dying and actually helping reduce the population. Doesn't make any sense. I'd love for somebody to explain it to me that does, but have heard that. Let me know if you. So that's why I think that people should be paying attention to Bill Gates and the things that he invests in and gets himself involved in. Because whether it is just playing us all for profits, or if it is this more sinister motivation of depopulation, the things that he is involved in are really scary. Having that much control over our food supply, having that kind of influence in the World Health Organization and the CDC, and these connections with these pharmaceutical companies and these vaccines that we are all in some cases being mandated to take. And these are not new allegations that have come out from just, COVID and the dawn of social media. There has been people suspicious and alarm about this man and his intentions and motivations for almost 2 decades now. And I don't think it hurts to listen and maybe not take the fact checker's word for everything, but ask a few genuine questions for yourself, and then have those questions in mind when you read the fact checks and see if these fact checking experts actually address any of those topics. I appreciate everybody for hanging in here and let me rant about Bill Gates for this long. And I hope you tune in for the next couple episodes that we're going to do where we ask a few genuine questions about this COVID vaccine rollout and the propaganda that surrounded that.